There you all are, and welcome in to Six Screen Sunday. Well, my name's Rick Farron. I'm up here at the control panel in Massachusetts. We have a number of people on our telephone line already. We also have people coming in on our YouTube video chat, and that's good. And we thank those for coming in today. Well, anyways, we've got Scott Walton and Jody Bishop. They are two Christian apologists, and they have a program on here called Knowing God After Leaving the Watchtower. So they'll give you a little idea of what they're going to be talking about today. Let's bring Scott on the stage. Let's bring Jody on as well. So, Scott, tell the audience what's going on today.
Today we're going to talk about the Great Flood of Noah's Day and the science behind it. So that's it, the flood.
Well, I'll tell you what. I mean, that is something. I know you went down there to the Noah's Ark. What was that, in Kentucky, I think?
Yes.
And boy, you were really impressed by that. So I think there's some residual thoughts running through your mind after seeing that. So I'm glad you can discuss that today. So Jody's in the truck as usual. And, you know, that's a real truck, by the way. That's not some prop. We have one listener that thinks it's a prop, but that's the real thing. And there he is down in Mississippi today. So, okay, I'm going to, why don't you take me out?
Yeah, okay. So I'll just take over from here. Thanks, Rick. We'll get back to you guys when it's time for phone calls. We'll have to add Rick back to the stage. But for now, it's just going to be Jody and I saying, hi, everyone. Thanks for watching and for coming out to our show. Jody, tell them who we are and what we do.
We are the disciples of YHWH, Yahweh in Christ. We got a YouTube channel named the Disciples of Yahweh in Christ. Email us. The link should be below the screen. If you got any questions, sometimes questions become part of the program. Sometimes we've done a whole program on just the one question, or if there were comments, sometimes we've done programs on the comments. So keep us in your prayers, and we got a great action-packed lineup for you today. You know, knowing God, the Great Flood. I mean, scientific evidence that the Great Flood actually existed. I think the evidence is a lot. I mean, you cannot get behind you cannot know all the scientific facts and not believe in the flood, I think. So I think it's evidence beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah, and one of the reasons this came up is because there have been some questions on the Christian court, and I wanted to deal with it. Questions about the flood, questions about Noah's Ark, and questions of science. And we really haven't talked about science much here on Knowing God after leaving the Watchtower. That's our show here. So I thought, hey, this is a good opportunity. We need to talk about the flood and Noah's Ark. So today it's the flood. Next time we'll talk about Noah's Ark, because we got to establish that there was a flood for the ark to float on. Both of these are fascinating topics, but today I want to stick with just the flood. So I won't say a lot about the ark, but we will get to the ark on our next episode. So that'll be good. Now, as regard things of science and the Bible, there are some Christians who see the science as the enemy of the Bible. Now, Jody and I don't believe that. We don't think that's the right view. God told us to explore his world, to look at the creation so we can know his attributes. So we think science, when it's done correctly, is a good thing. It's a godly thing. There's good science and there's bad science. Good science supports the Bible, and there's lots of science that that can confirm the scriptures. So that part of what we're going to talk about today, but let me discuss how this can relate to the Watchtower and our audience, who are mainly people who are former JWs. Why would that affect you? Well, when you come out of an organization like the Watchtower and you understand that they've lied to you, it's tempting to reject everything. You know, there are people who don't want anything to do with religion. They don't want to read the Bible. They don't want to know God. And that makes them vulnerable to arguments from internet infidels, as a certain group of atheists are called, And one of the things they love to attack is Noah's flood and Noah's ark. So that's why we need to talk about it. Is it possible that there was a global flood? Does that make sense with the evidence that we see around us and the world that we're living on? Could it have been flooded? So one of the questions that came in the Christian court was, where'd all the water go? And I wanted to deal with another question. Where did it come from? So, and also about the flood myths. A lot of people know there are flood myths found all over the world. What about those? Why believe this one in the Bible? So in order to help those who have come out of the Watchtower understand, you don't have to reject everything in the Bible. It's not utter nonsense, and there is good reason to believe it. We want to talk today about the flood and the evidence for the flood and the scientific view of the flood. So let's deal with some evidence that supports, that is in favor of a global flood. I want to start with the fossils, because fossils are absolutely fascinating. Everybody loves to see fossils. There are extinct animals that we only know about from their fossils. And so we can imagine them running around like the dinosaurs, but we don't see any unless you watch Jurassic Park. Then you can see them. So is the fossil record, the fossils that we find, does it agree with a flood, the possibility of a flood? Does it support a flood? Well, yeah, because what we have is billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. And that is exactly what a flood would do. A giant flood, a global flood, would kill every living thing. That's what the Bible says happened. Killed every living thing and bury them rapidly in water. And that fossil record is completely compatible with rapid burial in water and mud and silt, which is exactly what we expect from a flood. So there is this idea, or perhaps the thought that's out there in the culture, that it takes millions of years for fossils to form. Is that true? And that used to be one of the evidences that there couldn't have been a flood, because just a few thousand years ago, if you use the ages and the dates in the Bible, the flood has to be several thousand years ago. It can't be millions and millions. But if it took millions of years for fossils to form, then that couldn't be the source of the fossils. So does it take millions of years to form a fossil? The answer is no. We actually have fossils of modern objects, like a bowler hat that became fossilized. You can actually make a fossil in your kitchen. And I'm going to put up on the screen. Let me see if I can get this like that. Now, I need to put this in the big one. Come on. Okay, it's not cooperating with me right now. I think I did it wrong. No, this is my window. That's it. Okay, I'm still learning how to drive. Please be patient. Bear with me here. Here's a picture of an experiment you can do to make your own fossil. Step one, on the left, you cut out a sponge, an old cellulose type sponge, in the shape of a bone. Step two, you get a pot of water, you heat it on the stove, you pour in Epsom salt, and you keep dissolving the Epsom salt in the water until it's super saturated. Then you pour that water on the sponge and you let it evaporate over several days. Right? This is the experiment you can do, and it will turn hard as a rock. It will turn into a fossil. And that will be, this is an experiment you can do with the kids to show them how fossils, one way that fossils are made. There are different ways to make fossils, but this one can be done in your kitchen. It can be done in just a few days, and you see that it doesn't take millions of years for fossils to form. And as I said, we find modern objects that have been turned into fossils, man-made things. So no, it doesn't take millions of years, and therefore it's possible the flood could be thousands of years ago, and fossils would make sense with that. So here's another, this is a thought experiment. Imagine a brontosaurus, the biggest dinosaur you can think of. Let me put that up on the screen. Okay, brontosaurus. Here's a picture of, I think this is a float from a Sinclair oil. I wonder how many of you remember Sinclair oil. And they had these giant like paper mache type dinosaurs out by their gas stations. When I was growing up, I've seen these live and in person. But it's because they thought at the time They used to think that dinosaurs were the source of oil. So the dinosaurs died, they were buried, their bodies turned into oil. And so when you're pumping oil in the car, you're putting liquid dinosaur. Well, turns out that's wrong. It was not animal matter, but plant matter that formed the oil that we pump into our cars. So anyway, imagine a dinosaur. I'm dealing with how long does it take a fossil to form? Imagine a dinosaur, the largest one you can think of, like a brontosaur or a patasaurus, the really big ones. It dies and falls over. It's laying on its side. Well, how thick is it? Now, if it's going to take millions of years for the slow buildup of sedimentation to bury that thing, for all that time, for most of that time, it's exposed. And what happens to a dead body that's been exposed? It doesn't take millions of years. The scavengers begin to eat it. It decays, rots, it will dissolve, and it'll just be completely gone in 100 years or a few hundred years for sure. No way it's going to last a million years. So how could it form a fossil? It can't be made into a fossil if it is just left there and slowly, slowly, slowly buried. But if it's rapidly buried by floodwaters, by mudslides, then that would make more sense of what we find in the fossil record, rapid burial by water, which is exactly what the great flood of Noah's day would do. So here again is an evidence in the geology that's compatible with a flood, like the one described in the Bible. So we have to have rapid burial. We find bone graveyards and a whole bunch of the same kind of animal all buried in the same place. Some of these are in Montana, right here in the United States. And I'm sure all over the world we find these things. The same kind of animal all buried in the same place. Why would it be that the same animals, the fossil graveyards, as they call them? Well, if they were all running away from the flood together, a pack or herd, and they were swept up by the flood and rapidly buried, that would make sense of why all these things are buried in a graveyard. Now, in other places, we see graded bone beds where you just have a bunch of bones, hundreds or thousands of animals worth of bones, and the bones are sorted by size. Largest ones on the bottom, smallest ones on the top. How does that happen? With slow deposition. That's not gonna sort the size of the bones. But if they were suspended in water and silt, that makes more sense. Larger bones go to the bottom, smaller ones to the top. They're sorted if they were in water. So again, this makes more sense when we think of a flood than if we think of slow accumulation of sediment. All right. We find polystrate fossils. Polystrate means going through multiple strata, multiple rock layers. For example, a tree that goes up through different rock layers. And according to the standard dating, those would be millions of years for each of those layers. But how can a tree have been sitting there for millions of years? Just like a body will decay, a tree will decay once it dies. A dead tree isn't going to continue to be there. It will dissolve also. Living things work to maintain homeostasis. That is to keep their cells alive, to keep them fibrous and flexible and soft. And, our bodies regulate temperature. That's why we sometimes sweat and other times shiver. Our body's trying to keep that optimum temperature to keep our cells alive. So as long as you're alive, that process is going on. It keeps you from decaying, right? But when the body dies or the tree dies, decay processes take over and it can't last for millions of years sitting there waiting for the sand to slowly bury it. So a rapid burial by floodwaters makes more sense of these fossils that go up through multiple layers of rock. Okay, so one more thing. This is just fossil evidence from animals who lived on the earth that were, it's completely compatible with them being taken by a flood. There are tracks, so footprints, where their feet are going, they're walking in a certain direction. We see these tracks, and yet their feet are not parallel to the direction of travel. They're off at an angle. They're kind of walking sideways or crab ways, Why would they be doing this? Well, again, it makes sense if the waters of the flood are pushing them, with the current pushing them, so they have to walk, to get over there, they have to walk against the current. So their feet are angled. And so we see these trackways that go in generally in a straight line. Well, that's what you do when you're fleeing from the flood. You see it's over there. We want to get over there to high ground to get away from the water. Then you walk in a straight line. Well, another thing that's amazing about the tracks that we find in the sedimentary layers is you will find a bunch of tracks in one layer, and then several layers up, you'll find the dead bodies. Now, again, this doesn't make sense if this was millions of years of accumulation, because that means at one era of history, these critters walked everywhere, but they never died. Then millions of years later, we find their dead bodies, and at a time when they died but never walked. You see, that doesn't make sense, but it makes a lot more sense if they were fleeing from the flood. So there's a flood layer that they walked through, leaving their tracks, and then more flood inundations came up and missed them, but eventually the flood got them, killed them, and then their bodies are in that other layer. So again, all this makes sense in terms of a flood, but not so much in terms of a just a slow accumulation. All right. So now I want to check with Jody and see what you have to add, fossils or whatever evidence you want to add about that's compatible with the flood.
Well, I have to add that, I think the tree is one of the strongest proofs. I mean, if it was millions of years, maybe enough dust settled. But, explaining the tree going upright to me is one of the best evidences, because how did you get millions of years off that sediment if the tree is standing upright? And we got multiple cases of this. So I think that's direct proof that the tree died all of a sudden. And that's great proof. And there's like lots of other evidences of, the fossils getting on top of the mountains. How did the fossils get on top of the mountains when there was no ocean there? But the reason they got on top of the mountains is because of the fossils. They died, they died there, and they floated up to the top of the mountains sometimes. We got seashells that are on top of the mountains. So how did they get there if the floodwaters, it proves the floodwaters got over top of the mountains. So I think there's a lot of scientific proof or scientific evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that the worldwide flood did exist. So I do like the tree example, or the mountains with seashells on top of the mountains. That's another good illustration that we've got.
Yeah, those are good evidences. And I think that, if there were no evidences, we could be skeptical about the flood narrative in the Bible. We go, wait a second, a flood should leave traces. I mean, something that massive, all that water. I mean, when we look at modern day floods, we see how much devastation they do, how they can reshape a landscape. To imagine a global scale flood, it was going to leave some evidence. If we found nothing, absolutely nothing, then we could go, okay, yeah, that story doesn't really add up. And here's a good example. Look at the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon that Joseph Smith Jr. wrote claims that there were these societies living in North America, and that they had chariot wheels, they built walled cities, they had coinage, they minted coins, they made metal weapons, they had wheels and chariots, horses and elephants. We find no evidence of any of those things I've just mentioned in North America for the time frame given. No horses, no elephants, no chariot wheels, no metal weapons, no wheels, no walled cities. So if there had been civilizations in that time frame, we're not talking too terribly long ago, we have we have ruins from earlier civilizations in Europe, but nothing in North America for the time frame given. So there's good reason to doubt the story in the Book of Mormon that says these things happened in this place in that time. Well, the Bible is saying this thing happened. This flood happened in this time, several thousand years ago, and it was global, and there was all this water and everything died. If we found no evidence, we could go, okay, that doesn't really add up. But we find plenty of evidence that's compatible with a flood. So there's no reason to doubt this story just because of, the fossils and the rocks. Well, let's talk a little bit about the rocks, because rock layers also give us some insights. So the sedimentary layers, as we call those, layers and layers of rock, a good place to see them would be in the Grand Canyon. You can see the layers here. Let me put up a picture. Let's see. I think that will put up a picture. You can see the rock strata. And, oh, wow, that's dim. Why is it dim? It shouldn't be dim. Okay, there we go. Now it's bright. So if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, I think wherever we're broadcasting right now, you can see the image. But if not, just picture in your mind the side of the Grand Canyon where you have those stripes. What are those stripes? They're strata, rock strata, layers of rock. And what do they tell us? Well, they give evidence also of rapid burial because they're so straight and flat. Now, the conventional paradigm says that they were built up slowly over millions of years. But if you had a bunch of soil just sitting there for millions of years, there should be erosion channels, right? Water running off from rains or from snow melt carves little grooves because it doesn't wash over in a sheet. It cuts little grooves. It makes rivers and rivulets. But we see these things are completely flat. There's no unevenness. Also, over those millions of years, you would have microorganisms and other small creatures in the soil churning it up. Earthworms and the like, the creatures that live in the soil, the plants planting and planting their roots and breaking up the soil and then compacting it. This process over and over would churn up that soil and make it uneven. But what we see is completely flat. That doesn't make sense with slow deposition. It makes sense with a rapid burial. A flood water comes bringing all this silt. It deposits the silt, which is wet for a while. Then the flood water recedes, that begins to harden. And then another wave of the flood comes and deposits more silt, and you get these lines. We even see this kind of thing happening in our day. When there's a flood, it can create these layers and even carve out a little canyon out of the layers. So we see these kind of mini Grand Canyons that look a little bit like the big one, and they give us some understanding of how they can form. So here's one. Again, if you're watching, this is Burlingame Canyon. You can go and look it up, and it has, it's a canyon wall. You can see the walls just like in the Grand Canyon. It has the straight layers, the sedimentary layers, just like the Grand Canyon. It's a very much smaller scale. It's tiny by comparison. But this was carved out in only 3 days. We have the before and after pictures because in photographs, right? So this is modern day. It's a time when there were photographs. It took 3 days to carve out this little canyon, and it has the same kinds of sedimentary rock layers. And how this is done, again, with those floodwaters, they deposit silt, it builds up in layers, and then other floodwater comes and carves out, or mud flows come and carve the canyon while it's still kind of wet. So again, all this is indicative of floodwaters, and so it's entirely compatible with what we see. Now, when you ask, what about the Grand Canyon? How was that formed? Well, when we have this global flood, you have all these waters coming up over the land surfaces. And what the creation scientists, the Christian scientists who do this, they're PhD scientists. These are real scientists, not kooks or quacks or anything. They suppose, we can't prove this because no one can see it, that there was a giant inland lake, that some of the water from the flood was trapped on top of what's now the North American continent. in a giant lake. And for a while, it just sat there, maybe for months or years, but eventually it found a channel to drain off the continental shelf and back into the ocean basin. And when it did that, all that water rushing out carved out the Grand Canyon. And it probably just took a few days to carve it out. Giant flood, waters can carve canyons, and this was just one of the massive ones because there's a massive inland lake. So anyway, that would be a description of how we got the canyon. And by the way, the idea that modern scientists have is that this canyon was carved by that little river down there, the Colorado River. And again, I'm putting it up on the screen, I think. Yeah, okay, it's on the screen now. So that they want to say that that thin ribbon of river carved out this canyon. But then why would it be that the walls are at that steep angle, right? Imagine if you took a piece of floss, wrapped it around a candle, and then sawed back and forth on that floss. Are you going to get a canyon in the side of your candle, or are you going to get a thin groove, right? You're just going to get a little groove from the thin ribbon constantly rubbing away. But that's not what we have in the Grand Canyon. We have that canyon shape with the wide open top and the narrow bottom. So it makes more sense on a flood model. And there are good scientists out there providing these models. Okay, so we're looking at Noah's flood and asking, is it plausible? Could it have been real? Do we see evidence for it? And yes, we see lots of evidence in the rocks. Another thing that's quite amazing, in those sedimentary layers, which are so flat and so perfectly have a perfect knife edge, sometimes we see layers that are bent into S curves. So they're curved. So now if that had been solid rock and you tried to bend it, say from an uplift, a fault line or an earthquake that lifts up part of the land and the other part, stays or goes down, that would shatter the rock if it were hard. And the only way you could get those S curves in multiple layers of sediment would be if they were still wet and pliable. Then they could be bent, and once bent, because of the earthquake or whatever, they would then dry and harden in that way. So this makes more sense of a flood where everything's wet. And we see more and more evidence like that. So let me stop with the rocks right there. We looked at fossils. We talked about rock evidence. And I'm saying that all of this is compatible with a flood. Now, does it prove that there was a flood? Does it prove it scientifically? No, it doesn't. It's compatible with a flood, but it's not proof. You cannot prove there was a flood in our history any more than you can disprove it, at least scientifically, right? Science is done by repeatable, observable experiments in which variables can be controlled. You can't do any of that with the past, with history. We can't repeat the flood. We can't observe the flood. We can't observe the history of that time period or how the sedimentary rocks were laid down. Now, we can make observations that we see, things like Mount St. Helens erupting and carving out canyons like that canyon that I showed you. We can see those things happening, sedimentary layers laid down in a few hours. We can see fossils that you make in your own kitchen, and we can ask which makes better sense of the evidence. But we can't prove it one way or the other. So I'm not saying this is scientific proof of a flood. I'm saying this is evidence that's entirely compatible with a flood. And it's the kind of evidence we would expect to see if there was a flood. And if we didn't see all this evidence, we would have good reasons to doubt the flood. But because we have these and more evidences, there's good reason to accept the flood is at least possible. And there's no reason to reject the Bible, which is what a lot of people will say. Oh, okay, well, if that flood is impossible and Noah's Ark is impossible, we can reject the Bible, and then we don't have to, deal with Jesus and God and judgment. So that's why I'm talking about this on this show, because people who have come out of the Watchtower might be attracted to these arguments that say, oh, there was no flood, there was no Noah's Ark, therefore I can disbelieve the Bible. And we see this attack does go on, and it does convince people. Even some Christians have doubts about Noah's flood and Noah's Ark. But, as Rick mentioned, I went to Kentucky to see the Ark replica, and we'll talk about the Ark next episode. But there's also at the Ark, they have exhibits talking about the flood and about the Ark. And they have a creation museum also where they talk about flood and evidences for the flood. But these scientists, they don't claim that they can prove it scientifically, because they accept science is what, true science is repeatable, observable, and controlled variables. And we don't have that. But they show this is evidence that's compatible. And this evidence can be analyzed scientifically in our modern time, but it cannot be proven. So I just want to be clear. We're not saying this is proof, but it's good evidence that's compatible. And, it's up to you to decide, but I just don't want people to be rejecting the Bible. Or if you hear your relatives, I'm saying this, or your friends, I'm saying there's not possible that there could have been a flood. It is possible, and there's good reason, good evidence. Okay, I want to check in with Jody. Is he still there? He's gone. Okay, there's no checking in with Jody until he returns. But let me just say a few more things, and then I want to open up the phone lines and hear your comments, your questions, and I'll look in YouTube chat, and we'll talk more about flood, hopefully about the flood. So as I was saying, all right, we can't prove this scientifically. So why believe the flood? Well, Christians believe it because it's in the Bible. And of course, we believe the Bible. Jesus believed that there was a flood. When we go to Matthew 24, where he's talking about the second coming, he says, "For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man." So you see, okay, Jody is here. I was just saying how Jesus believed that there was a flood. So those of us who are Christians, followers of Jesus, accept that. And in this passage I just read you, Matthew 24, he mentions Noah, the days of Noah, the flood, and the ark, and how people were carried away. And so, yes, it's not scientific. It is biblical, and it is confirmed by Jesus. So that's where we are. But Jody, I talked about the rocks. I don't know how much you heard, but the rocks and the rock layers as evidence, and how we can't prove any of this scientifically, but you also can't disprove it scientifically. What are your comments or thoughts?
Well, I think the rock layers that you were mentioning gives good evidence. I think the tree layer, where the tree is standing up, gives good evidence. The seashells gives good evidence. But I think the best evidence actually comes from Jesus Christ himself. If Jesus Christ is a true person, which he is, if Jesus Christ is truly God, which he is, then he should know. So he said Noah's flood was true. And, he didn't explain all the scientific evidence. He said it was true. If Jesus said it, that's good enough for me. Jesus wouldn't lie about something that major. And if you don't believe in the flood, I think you've got problems with the Bible. If it's just a true myth, like some theologians say, then I think you got issues with the Bible. It was good enough for Jesus, good enough for me.
Yeah, and another thing, I think some people would suggest maybe the New Testament doesn't deal with this, that it was in the Old Testament. But yeah, Jesus confirms Noah, ark, flood. Peter talks about the flood in this chapter right here, 2 Peter 2. He says, "If he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly." So there is the flood and Noah and the 7 with him. That's pretty good. And in chapter 3 of the same book, he talks about how the earth was formed out of water, and then it was deluged. And right, where is that? I should have marked this. It was deluged with water and perished, right? So again, confirming the flood. So it's biblical, and that's why we believe it. And of course, as I said, there's plenty of evidence that's compatible. So you can't deny the flood just by saying, oh, science disproves the flood. It doesn't. Oh, now I mentioned there are other myths. There are other flood myths found all around the world with certain similarities to the biblical story and a lot of dissimilarities. But amazingly, in lots of different, even somewhat isolated cultures, we see a flood story, a story about a universal or a global flood that destroyed a bunch of people. And right, there's lots of different variations. So why believe this one? Well, the Bible's flood story explains the things that we see, and these other stories, they don't have specifics. They tend to be written in poetry as a myth. They're not presented as just historical evidence. Now, in the Genesis chapter 6 through 9, we just have a description. It's not poetry. It's not an epic myth. It's not about how the gods did this or did that, the other. It's about this guy Noah and his family and how they went through this flood and all the animals that were killed and why. So it has a different ring to it. It rings true. It's compatible with the evidence. And next time when we talk about the ark, I'll explain about one of the other arks and how we can be sure that that was not a good design for the ark, whereas the ark of Noah was a good design. And how would he know that, or how would anyone who was making this up, if it were just a myth? Those things wouldn't matter. But we have details like the dimensions of the ark that are important. And you can build a replica, and there have been many and some that float. So it is a good design. But basically, what we're dealing with here, in regards to some people saying, "Oh, the flood is just a myth; it's not compatible with science," it's everybody looking at the same evidence, the rocks and the fossils and all that, but they come to different conclusions. And basically, this is like a court case. In a court case, let's say we're trying someone for murder, and the prosecution is going to bring all this evidence, things that the police found at the scene, a weapon that they think is the murder weapon, fingerprint evidence, DNA evidence, photos of the crime scene, et cetera, et cetera. But nobody was actually there and saw it. You cannot prove, even with the evidence that's laid out, you can't prove that that guy on trial murdered that person who's dead. So the prosecution brings all this evidence to try and suggest, because their interpretation is this evidence suggests to us that guy is the murderer. The defense attorney or team is going to look at the exact same evidence, and they're going to say, "Oh no, this is not what you think it is. That was an accident. His fingerprints happen to be on the weapon that they call murder weapon, and we just say it's not a murder weapon." Or someone else used it who wore gloves, and so his fingerprints were still on there, but the other guy actually didn't. They have to interpret the same evidence in a different way, and then the jury or the judge, whoever's deciding, is going to say, "I think they did a better job of interpreting evidence versus them." And so that's all we can do with the evidence for the flood in the fossils and the rocks. We could say, what's the better explanation? And as all the things that I've laid out, and there's more, if you want to go and research this, it's really a fascinating topic. Was there a global flood? How did the Grand Canyon come into being? What are all those sedimentary layers? The fossils, how did they come to be? And in what time frame? Fascinating stuff. This is good science, asking questions and asking, what does the evidence say? And these Christian scientists say we can look at the same evidence that the secular scientists look at, and we find it completely compatible with the flood narrative given in Genesis chapter 6. There's no reason to doubt the Bible because of the evidence. All right. Let's talk about whether the flood was global or local, because there are some people who want to say, even Christians who want to say, oh, it was just a local flood only in the Middle East. That's where all the people was. And so it killed all the people who were on the planet. Does that work? Well, no, it doesn't work for several reasons. For one thing, the Bible says that it was all the earth and all the mountains under all the high heavens. It keeps using this word, all. And, every living thing is going to be blotted out. All the fountains of the great deep burst forth. Every beast and all the livestock and every creeping thing, every bird, every winged creature, all need to go into the ark so that they'll be preserved, because all flesh, in which is the breath of life, will die. And so we keep seeing this word all. In fact, in those 4 chapters, 6 through 9, the word all in Hebrew appears 71 times. 71 times in 4 chapters. It just keeps emphasizing all. So it's clear this is a universal flood. And to try and dismiss it just doesn't make sense of the text. It also doesn't make sense of the region of the Middle East, because to say it was a local flood and it looked somewhat pretty much like it does today, the water wouldn't be contained in there because the shape of the Middle East is a bowl that's open on the south side. So all the water would just run out. It wouldn't stay there for a year. The flood narratives tell us it would be there for a year, and it wouldn't kill all the people. Why would all the people still be in this one little valley? And the animals have no reason to stay in one place. It doesn't make sense that they would all be killed. And if the flood is just going to be in that little basin, why didn't Moses or Noah and family just move outside, go to Egypt, go to, just over the mountains and live there for a year, come back when the flood's done in the little Middle East? And the worst problem is the proponents of this local flood in the Middle East will have to say it left no traces. It left no traces. Well, that's impossible. The amount of water that you would need to flood the entire Middle East basin would leave evidence, just like these things we were looking at, canyons that are carved out, fossils of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water. There's no way that much water doesn't leave evidence. Even the things like I showed you, that canyon that was carved out. Eruptions of Mount St. Helens have completely reworked the landscape. You can't imagine such a large flood, even a local one, because we see local floods that do leave permanent marks. So the idea of a local flood doesn't make sense. And I feel like Jody will have something to say at this point. Jody, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. A local flood just, to me, doesn't make scientific sense. It doesn't make biblical sense. And, when word all, like 71 times you made a reference, I believe the word all truly does mean all. And I think all of the world was flooded. And we see evidence, the flood in Noah's day. Noah was in probably the Middle East, but then in America, the Grand Canyon was a long ways away, and we see evidence for the flood with the Grand Canyon, like you mentioned. It could have been a matter of days. It could have been maybe even months for the Grand Canyon to form, but it was formed in a short amount of time and not over millions and millions of years, according to the evidence. And I like sticking with evidence. I like sticking with biblical evidence. And I think the true, and I think the flood narratives throughout all the lands. I mean, how did all these societies have a flood story? Because their ancestors was Noah. Their great grandfather was Noah, and they passed down the stories. Obviously, they changed, because that's what happens to stories when they change and not wrote down. But, the Bible said not to lie, so the Bible's story didn't actually change.
Right. Well, look who's here. I saw you guys talking in the chat about Nadine. we don't buy clothes that need ironing. I don't think.
I know how. My mom taught me how, but
Do we own an iron?
we own an iron.
Danietta was asking if she irons my shirts, and no, we don't.
I just make sure that he buys things that don't need ironing.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody.
So I told her to come by. We're talking about the flood and the rocks and the fossils, but now it's time to open up the phone line. So let's see, what do you guys have to say about the flood? Any comments, any questions? I saw somebody in the chat say, I feel like a fossil. We know that feeling. *6 if you want to speak. Oh, and I got to put...
believe in a flood. I've met very few scientists that disbelieve the flood. The atheists there at Skeptical Inquiry, they want to say that the flood didn't happen, but every physicist, chemist, and geologist and biologist that I ever met and chatted with did believe the flood. So it's believed around the world. The Dalai Lama recently said he knew it happened because there's shells in the Himalayas. And he also had genetic tests of his people in Tibet with the native peoples in the Navajo lands of America. And they are genetically similar, and they have a flood myth that they lived on top of the mesa for a very long time. So it was very deep water. It was worldwide. Just about every culture has a flood story. The flood stories are very similar to the Noah narrative, and it happened.
Yeah. That's amazing that you've talked to so many who acknowledge it. I think the evidence is convincing, and it has convinced even some secular scientists, although they might debate about the timing of the flood and whether all the dinosaurs were buried or at that time, and the other fossils that we find. But yeah, that's good. They're coming around. The evidence is compelling. Anyone else?
And one of the reasons that it's kind of a war zone there in Turkey, or I think people would have foot the ark. There was a kind of fly-by-night film company in the 1960s, and they sent a film crew there, and the guy was standing next to the ark. I don't doubt that little independent film was true. It was before independent films were applauded. So I somewhere they got the thing.
Okay, there was a little bit of broken up there, but I think you're talking about Turkey and the sites in Turkey that some people think are Noah's Ark. There's actually several places that have been thought that they might contain the Ark. And well, we were not supposed to talk about the Ark today, but that's fine.
Yeah.
It's kind of like one of those where there's so many tombs of Jesus. You got to be skeptical about everyone and say, is it really the Ark? It would be hard for all that wood to last for so many thousands of years. And they probably, when they came off the Ark, took some of the wood to make houses and build towns.
Petrified wood does exist in America.
Yeah, that's true. Wood can petrify, but yeah, it doesn't
like
always.
You said, you just come off of being on the Ark for over a year. Everything's waterlogged in the world, everything. So you're going to need wood to live.
Right, to build houses. And then your kids.
Your fires.
All right.
Your cook fires. Yeah.
You cannibalize the Ark.
Gee, there's a bunch of wood over there.
From mature trees, which there aren't any now because
they're all washed away.
Yeah, so I'm always a little skeptical about, it'd be great if they found the Ark as evidence because that would convince a lot of people. But I don't know that they're going to. But sure, it'd be great. Okay, Debbie finally spotted you.
Yeah, hi Debbie.
Anyone else want to speak or? I am looking for comments.
Yeah.
Well, I want to bring up Scott.
I think there's very few cultures that don't
Uh,
have a flood myth. So it's more cultures have one than don't have one.
It's interesting.
yeah, Scott and Nadine. Good to see you, Nadine. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can hear you. Good to hear. Good to see you
Yeah,
too,
we've got
Rick.
some. Yeah, we do have some problems here with the internet. It's just kind of going in and out, but that's okay. We'll go forward anyways. But I like what you said halfway through the your conversation today, Scott. You said something that got my attention. A lot of Jehovah's Witnesses, when they get out of the organization, they have a tendency to really disprove the Bible. It's one thing to disprove the Watchtower, but they seem to go crazy with the idea of disapproving of the Bible, and they make a concerted effort to do that. And I'm glad you brought that up. That if you get online and you punch in "was Noah's Ark real," which I did during the conversation you had here today, and in most of the sites that come up, they disprove it. But again, there are sites that do prove it. I'm not sure we're even coming through here because of the internet connection. Can you hear me all right, Scott? Nadine?
Yeah, we hear you fine.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So, anyways, okay, they hear me. So, anyways, what I was thinking, but there are sites that do prove it, like you are doing today. But it seems like there's an ongoing battle or a real effort being made by secular history, secular scientists to disprove anything biblical. So you got to be careful. Things that you pick up on the net, you have to know where these people are coming from. But I do know I can speak for the ex-Jehovah's Witness world. There is an ongoing effort to try to disprove everything in the Bible. And if you get on some of these ex-JW forums and see what they're writing in there, a lot of it has to do with disproving the Bible. For what satisfaction they gain from that, I'm not really sure.
Yeah, well, of course, they just want to be done with religion. They don't want anyone telling them what to do.
They feel like it was God that hurt them. So
Right. So they want to push him away.
Yeah.
Keep him at arm's length.
And disprove him, and it's part of their trauma.
Right. Spiritual abuse. So
victim here. not of the JWs, but of spiritual abuse. It is a lifelong thing that you need to deal with.
Yeah.
So.
And because there's all that out there, Rick, that you were talking about, people trying to disprove this, I wanted to show everyone there's good reason to think this. You can go look these things up, decide for yourself, look at the evidences, but don't listen to anyone who says it's proven scientifically or it's disproven scientifically. We can't prove it or disprove it either way by science, but we can say there's good evidence, there's lots of evidence, and if we weren't, then we would doubt it, but we don't have to doubt it. And different people are convinced by different kinds of evidence. Some people like the fact that there are flood myths everywhere, and they think, hey, that's convincing. Jody likes the polystrate fossil. I find all of it is good. So we're just about out of time. So I want to close with just a short clip from a documentary. It's called Noah's Flood in North America. You can find it on YouTube. In fact, let me drop the link in the chat just so you guys can go and watch it offline. But I want to show you a little bit of this because it is something I think a lot of people don't recognize, that the flood was so very violent. If we think about all the local floods and how violent they were, imagine one that's global, all over the world. That would be utterly devastating. And I like to like that this video has, computer generated reenactments, what it might have looked like. So here we go. I'm going to play a little bit of this so you can see the violence of the flood, how the great fountains of the fountains of the great deep opened up, and the waters, the windows of heaven, so to speak, the rain fell down. The the breaking up of the fountains of the deep underneath the ocean would have caused volcanic eruptions. Those volcanoes under the water are releasing hot magma that steams the water, which goes up into the atmosphere until it reaches a point where it cools, and then having cooled, it comes back down as rain for 40 days and 40 nights. And this splitting of the fountains of the Great Deep sends out giant tsunami waves full of mud and water that wash up on the shore. Very violent. And again, this is happening all over the world. It's happening constantly. There's ash and smoke. It's cooling down the atmosphere, and it's going to reshape the planet. There is still today that ring of fire, that place where the crust opened up, broke apart, and it's where a lot of the fault lines are. A lot of the earthquakes are still happening. This is a super violent event, and too many people have come to believe in a placid flood, a calm flood. The waters go up, the waters go down, nothing else happens. That's not how floods happen today. That's not how they happened then. And of course, then the seafloor is breaking apart. There's subduction of plates by tectonic plates under another plate, which builds up friction. That friction gets released. You get a huge earthquake. That earthquake causes a tsunami because it's underwater. The tsunamis go up on the shore. And all this is happening at the same time over the course
Steve,
of
I just sent
40
you a
days.
link.
Okay, so you get the picture.
Yeah, get off Facebook link.
Okay, you guys can go and watch more of that documentary. I put it in chat. That's really good to see it and get some idea of how dramatic a global flood would be. And I hope this has been helpful. Next time we'll talk more about Noah's Ark. So if you have questions, bring them, because Noah's Ark is the really tough one that a lot of people struggle with. And it's fun because there's animals and there's poop, and what are we going to do with all their poop, and how do we feed them? It's just so fascinating. So that's our show for today. I'll give Jody the last word.
All right. Remember to keep us in your prayers. Look us up on Facebook. Look us up on YouTube, Disciples of YHWH in Christ. And most of all, keep us in your prayers. Until 2 weeks from now, adios. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
God bless.
Bye.
Well, bye, everyone. I'm so sorry for the internet connection here. It has happened a lot to Scott and Nadine on Sunday. I think Comcast does some work on Sunday because it's a slow non-business day. But we have got caught in that trap again. We heard most of everything, just a little choppy near the end. But thank you very much, Scott. Thank you, Jody. Thank you, Nadine, for coming in to the 6 screens today. We appreciate it. And we'll see you, as Jody said, in 2 weeks. Thank you very much. And for those still with us, we go to JW World News. That's coming up in 2 hours, or actually, I should say in an hour. But right now, we got Anne Marie coming in from California. She got a program, Jehovah's Witnesses share their Christian testimony. That's coming up next, right here on the 6 Screens Telenetwork. Thank you all. All right, we're going to